A thin ribbon of forgotten highway cut through the empty plains, and on its crumbling edge stood a man who looked like he had risen straight out of the soil. Arthur Vance adjusted the stiff collar of a tuxedo jacket that had once been white, but now carried the greenish stain of damp earth. His trousers were ripped, his face painted with the hollow shadows of the dead, and the cold breath of the prairie wrapped itself around him like an unwelcome shroud. A low mist crawled across the land, swallowing fences, signposts, and the horizon itself. It smelled like old storms and untouched dirt, as if the earth had been holding its breath for decades. Arthur tasted the metallic tang of it, sharp enough to pull him back into the moment. October had arrived, that strange season when warm winds die reluctantly, and winter's first whispers slip under your clothes before you realize you're shivering. He exhaled, and the fog devoured his breath instantly, as though the night were hungry for anything living. The famous old road stretched into the gray distance like a vein drained of blood. Once, people had traveled this asphalt searching for hope, chasing freedom, running from the past or toward a future they prayed would save them. Now it was only a memory cracked, faded, and ignored by the world rushing past on newer, faster concrete. But Arthur felt the history beneath his boots. The road hummed with ghosts only he seemed willing to notice, echoes of laughter from families packed into rusted cars, the low rumble of engines carrying soldiers home, the quiet weeping that came from leaving everything behind. 1,000 lives had left their mark here, and tonight he hoped to add one more. He touched the tiny camera disguised as an old button stitched to his jacket. It blinked a faint red. The microphone blooming from his lapel looked like a funeral flower, fitting for the character he was pretending to be. Every heartbeat, every breath, every tremor in his voice would be captured. 200 yards away, hidden behind a dying line of cottonwoods, his crew huddled around their monitors. Devin and Sam, young, eager, addicted to the dream of instant fame, whispered excitedly each time the feed sharpened. The gear they used cost more than Arthur had earned in years, but this was their big swing, their gamble on a show no one had asked for but everyone would talk about if it worked. Tonight was the beginning, the first episode, the trial run of something they hoped would pull them out of obscurity. Dead Stop Extreme Encounters. Arthur took one slow step toward the empty highway, the fog swallowing him like a curtain rising on a dangerous, lonely stage. Arthur kept reminding himself that the whole plan was supposed to be simple enough that even the algorithm wouldn't get confused. Look like a corpse, stand by the road, scare a few kind-hearted drivers, reveal the joke before anyone called the police, upload the footage, watch the views roll in, pray that this stunt might resurrect a career that had died quietly, without applause or witnesses. He shifted his stance, boots crunching on loose gravel he bought secondhand from a charity shop in Tulsa. The latex and glue beneath his jaw pinched his skin, the kind of slow itch that drove a person mad when they couldn't scratch it. The fake blood packet taped to his chest felt almost alive, warmed by his own body struggling to stay comfortable in the Oklahoma cold. His heart murmured unevenly, tapping out a pattern that didn't match the rhythm of the night. Stress had a way of dragging old wounds out of hiding. He once prided himself on becoming a character completely, not the glamorous, name-dropping version of method acting, but the real bone-deep transformation that demanded more than talent. It required surrender. He used to let roles consume him, let them push his own thoughts aside and fill him with someone else's grief, hunger, fury. He slept in costume, eaten in character. Let the work cracken open and pour something foreign into the empty spaces. He remembered a winter in Pittsburgh, performing Lear in a theater where the radiators groaned like chained beasts, and the audience breathed little clouds in the freezing air. Every night he aged himself decades, railing against betrayal and fate with a voice that felt like it belonged to a man far older and far more broken than himself. Another year, he played a doomed salesman in Minneapolis while the world outside froze solid. After each performance, he drove past glowing storefronts and cold parking lots, letting the character bury itself deeper in his chest. Critics said he didn't just portray the man, he let him live again. And on Broadway, he'd waited in the wings as Hamlet's understudy, rehearsing every ghost-haunted pause, every word etched into muscle memory. Night after night, he stood just beyond the curtain, ready to step into the role if fate called his name, ready to disappear into a myth if given the chance. Now here he was, pretending to be dead on an abandoned road for the internet's amusement. The fall from art to spectacle stung more sharply than the cold ever could. He used to stand just off stage, waiting for a miracle, a strained throat, a twisted ankle, any tiny disaster that would open the door for him. That's what understudies did, hover quietly, praying for an opportunity while pretending they were. He waited through 47 shows, listening to another man step into the spotlight, deliver the soliloquies, win the applause. When the curtain finally dropped for the last time, Arthur walked away with half a year gone and nothing, but a line on his resume destined to vanish in the fog of forgotten theater credits. After that, the industry began letting go of him, one finger at a time. The auditions stopped first, then the callbacks. He kept telling himself the silence was temporary, but the phone beside his bed grew colder week after week, buried under empty prescription bottles and bills he couldn't bring himself to open. He tried commercials, grinning into a lens, hyping things he'd never buy. The work felt hollow, like he was shouting into a room where no one bothered to turn on the lights. He even landed a few quick roles on a crime drama, always playing some unnamed stranger the audience would forget the moment the camera cut away. It didn't pay the rent. It barely paid for gas. Soon enough, he was driving strangers around at 2 in the morning, listening to slurred arguments and wiping vomit from the backseat. Months later, he was handing out tickets in a small Burbank theater, forced to smile at young actors rushing past him, hopeful, bright, untouched by disappointment. They carried scripts he would never read, headed for rehearsals he would never join. His apartment in Koreatown was a box with peeling paint and a window that stared directly into another identical box. After 9 at night, the shower only coughed out icy water. The toilet never stopped running, a soft, constant reminder of how life kept slipping through his fingers no matter how tightly he tried to hold it. But even after everything fell apart, one truth never abandoned him. He could still act. He still knew how to lose himself in someone else's skin, how to step out of his own life and into another. The craft stayed with him even when the world stopped watching. So when Devin and Sam approached him one afternoon, two excited kids with overpriced cameras and dreams bigger than their experience, he didn't walk away. They pitched some wild online show they swore would go viral, insisting that one lucky break could change everything. He nodded. He listened. He signed a napkin contract because that was all they could offer. They pressed $200 crumpled dollars into his palm and promised him a cut of whatever profits came later. He agreed because the alternative was driving circles around the city forever, or dying quietly in that cramped apartment, invisible to the world that once applauded him. If he refused the offer, he knew exactly how his story would end, discovered only when the stench drifted into the hallway, found by neighbors who'd never once bothered to learn his name. Anything was better than accepting that the man who once made audiences sob, who once carried kings and ghosts inside his chest, had become invisible to the very world that used to rise to its feet for him. The night pressed in around him. The fog had thickened so much it felt like he was standing inside a cloud that had lost its way. Then, far off in the murk, something growled low and heavy, like a creature waking up. Arthur straightened, letting his body fold into the posture of a man who'd barely survived a car wreck. He loosened his jaw, let his eyes glaze over, softened his breathing into something that sounded broken. 30 years of slipping into other skins had taught him how to change in the space between heartbeats. The engine's voice drew closer, not the thin sound of modern cars, but a deep, old-school roar, the kind of sound that came from a machine built when metal still mattered. Two bright beams pierced the fog, drifting toward him like floating moons carving tunnels through the gray. Arthur lifted one trembling hand, a tiny signal of desperation, the movement of someone reaching for help while knowing help might not come. The car eased to a stop beside him, a cherry-red Chevy Nova from another century, dust softened but proud. Its chrome caught the dim light and hardened it into a cold shimmer. Gravel crackled under the tires as the driver pulled onto the shoulder. The engine purred steadily, loved and cared for, the way some men cherish the last good thing life gave them. Up close, the car looked untouched by time, not rebuilt, preserved. Its paint gleamed without a scar. The glass was spotless, seamless. It looked like it had been lifted straight out of the past and placed here without aging a day. Arthur glimpsed his reflection in the bumper, a dead man's face staring back at him, greenish and hollow under the fake blood, so convincing he startled himself. Then the window on the driver's side began to lower, not with a modern buzz, but with the smooth, steady rhythm of a hand crank, a sound from an era when machines obeyed touch instead of buttons. The car idled on the shoulder, a heavy, dark beast from a forgotten era. Behind the wheel sat a man who looked like he'd been cut from a black and white photograph, hair slicked back tight, jawline rigid. He was wearing aviator sunglasses, which made no sense in the suffocating ink of a moonless night. The lenses were void of reflection, just two black pits staring into the abyss. Arthur committed to the bit, dragging his left leg as he limped toward the passenger side. Every wheeze, every stumble was calculated theater. He reached for the handle and the metal stung his palm. It wasn't just cool. It was a biting, unnatural frost, the kind of deep cold that radiates from the earth in winter graveyards. He pulled the heavy door open. The air inside didn't smell like a car. It smelled like an arson scene, stale smoke, charred wood, and old grease. Arthur slid into the seat. The driver didn't acknowledge him. He didn't blink. He simply shifted the heavy machine into gear and merged back onto the asphalt, gliding with the silent, terrifying smoothness of a predator. 5 seconds passed, then 20. The silence inside the cabin was pressurized, heavy enough to pop ears. Arthur decided to break the seal. He summoned the raspy, broken voice he'd been rehearsing all week. "Bad wreck back there," he choked out. "Few miles down." The driver said nothing. He didn't flinch. The road stretched out ahead of them, the headlights carving a lonely tunnel through the fog. It felt less like they were driving to a destination, and more like they were the last two people on Earth. Arthur pressed on, letting his genuine fatigue bleed into the lie. I don't know how I got out. The sound of it, the glass shattering. Still nothing. The stranger's hands were locked on the steering wheel, knuckles white, posture stiff as a corpse. Irritation began to prickle at the back of Arthur's neck. He'd run this gag on 3 other drivers tonight. They had panicked, asked questions, fumbled for their phones. This guy was a statue. Fine, Arthur thought. You want to play hard to get? Let's wake you up. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur moved his hand beneath his jacket. His fingers grazed the medical tape on his chest, finding the small plastic trigger. It was a simple rig, a pouch of corn syrup and dye, paired with a tiny explosive charge. A parlor trick designed to terrify. If words wouldn't break this guy's trance, a chest full of blood certainly would. He tightened his grip on the hidden trigger and squeezed. Splat! The sound was sickeningly wet, like a boot stepping into fresh mud or raw meat hitting a butcher's counter. The squib erupted against his chest, sending a hot, sticky flood soaking through his white shirt. It wasn't just red, it was a deep, oxygen-starved crimson. Arthur had spent weeks perfecting this recipe in his kitchen, mixing corn syrup and chocolate sauce until he found the exact shade of mortal injury. It didn't look like special effects. It looked like a catastrophic wound. Arthur clawed at the driver, slamming his blood-soaked hand onto the man's jacket. He gripped the fabric hard, making sure the stain transferred, making sure the horror was physical and undeniable. I'm not supposed to be here, Arthur choked out, letting the panic rise in his throat until it sounded like a death rattle. He leaned in, fully committing to the performance of a lifetime. I died back there. I know I did. I felt the impact. I felt the lights go out. I'm walking. But I'm not alive. Oh God, tell me I'm not really here. The driver didn't scream. He didn't recoil. He sighed. It was a long, heavy exhale through the nose, the sound of a man stuck in traffic, or a waiter realizing a customer is going to be difficult. It was the sound of pure, crushing boredom. Slowly, almost lazily, the driver lifted his foot off the gas. The heavy car began to decelerate, the engine's roar dropping to a low, throbbing growl. They drifted toward the edge of the darkness, the tires chewing loudly over the loose gravel of the shoulder. It sounded like teeth grinding on bone. The car rocked to a halt. For a moment, the only sound was the idle of the engine and Arthur's ragged, fake breathing. Then, with the slow, rusty precision of an old machine, the driver finally turned his head. He faced Arthur completely. The aviator stared blankly, two black mirrors reflecting the terror on Arthur's face. The driver finally turned his head. The movement was stiff, mechanical, like a rusted hinge forcing itself open. Behind those aviator lenses, there were no eyes to meet, just two obsidian mirrors reflecting Arthur's own pathetic disguise. He saw himself clearly in the glass, a middle-aged man painted green, playing a child's game, pretending to be a corpse while his real life slowly, boringly rotted away. "You are making a mess," the driver said. The voice was terrifyingly flat. It carried the emotional weight of someone reading a grocery list. "Get out." Arthur's stomach dropped. The prank wasn't just dead, it was dangerous. Silence is worse than anger, and this blank stare was worse than a scream. Arthur had taken a punch once decades ago. He remembered the flash of white light, the taste of copper. He was 53 now. His heart was a fragile, fluttering thing. He couldn't take a hit like that again. He broke character instantly. He threw his hands up, flashing his palms in desperate surrender. "Whoa, hey, relax." Arthur forced a laugh, but it came out as a nervous bark. "It's a bit, buddy, it's just a performance." The driver cut him off, his tone entirely unchanged. "I know." The words landed heavy and cold in the tight cabin. "I have been watching the performances for a very long time." Arthur froze, watching what? His hand shook as he pointed to the tiny black lens clipped to his lapel, his god, his savior, his camera. It's a prank show. Look, this isn't blood, it's corn syrup. Taste it." He frantically wiped his sticky palms on his pants, leaving streaks of fake gore on the fabric. The makeup felt suffocating now, shrinking on his skin as it dried. Inside his chest, his heart gave a sickening lurch. That irregular rhythm the doctors had warned him about, the one he kept pretending didn't exist. "You're the only one tonight who didn't even flinch," Arthur stammered, frantically trying to pivot, trying to salvage any scrap of dignity from the wreckage. "Seriously, buddy, you've got ice in your veins. Best poker face I've ever seen. What gave it away? The makeup, the timing." The driver rotated in his seat to face Arthur fully. It wasn't a fluid turn. It was rigid, segmented, like a rusted mechanism clicking into place notch by notch. When he spoke, the monotony was gone. His voice had changed. It was hollow now, vast and empty, like wind howling through the ribcage of a rotting house. "I knew you were not a phantom," the driver rasped, "because I could hear the blood pumping inside of you." The nervous laugh died in Arthur's throat. "And phantoms," the driver continued, "do not have pulses." Arthur stared, paralyzed. The man's lips weren't moving right. They were lagging behind the words, twitching a fraction of a second after the sound filled the car. It was a glitch in reality, like a badly dubbed foreign film. It wasn't a man speaking. It was something wearing a man, clumsily pulling the strings of a face it hadn't quite mastered. Arthur's hand scrambled for the door handle. The metal burned his palm, not with heat, but with a stinging, impossible frost that glued his skin to the latch. The car shouldn't be this cold. The engine was running. The heater was on. But the handle felt like a chunk of ice carved from a deep freezer. "Right," Arthur squeaked. His theatrical grit was gone, replaced by the small, terrified whisper of a child in the dark. "Good eye, real sharp. You ever think about acting, you've got the presence for it." "Also," the driver interrupted. The voice dropped an octave, vibrating with a buzzing, wrong frequency that made Arthur's vision blur. His bladder tightened. Every survival instinct he possessed, the ancient reptilian alarms buried deep in his DNA, began to scream. "Predator! Run! Get out! Ghosts do not pick up hitchhikers." The driver raised his hands to remove the sunglasses. In the pale dashboard glow, Arthur saw the fingers. They were wrong. They were spindly and pale, stretching far too long, with knuckles that bent in places where bone should be solid. The fingers that curled around the wire frames were nightmares of anatomy. They were pale, skeletal spiders, bending at angles that defied biology, as if they possessed too many joints or perhaps none at all. The movement was agonizingly slow, a ritual unveiling, the deliberate unmasking of a monster. "Most of us," the thing in the driver's seat rasped, "never leave the burning metal." He slid the glasses down. The bridge of his nose, or what was left of it, was revealed first. Then the rest followed. Arthur stopped breathing. There were no eyes. There was only the aftermath of an inferno. The sockets were twin craters of devastation, hollowed out by heat so intense it had erased the man and left only the ruin. It wasn't the clean, white bone of a skeleton. It was the shiny, puckered texture of melted vinyl. The skin around the holes had flowed like hot wax before hardening into twisted, chaotic ridges. It was a face that had been screamed into existence. The fire had dragged its fingers across his features, smearing the flesh like wet clay. One side was pulled tight, a taut sheet of scar tissue where a cheek should be. The nose was a collapsed mess, fused shut on one side, gaping open on the other, a raw, charred vent leading into a darkness deeper than the night outside. Looking into those empty pits felt like staring into the throat of a furnace that had consumed everything it ever touched. You could see the ghost of the man he used to be, buried somewhere under the ruin. Maybe 40 years ago, on a foggy stretch of road just like this one, he had been young, handsome even. But then came the screech of tires, the crumpled metal, and the explosion that turned a classic car into a crematorium. The fire had taken everything, his face, his life, his future, and left behind this wet, glistening sculpture of agony. Where a nose should have been, there was only a sealed, shiny ridge of scar tissue and a single, ragged hole. It whistled faintly as he breathed, a jagged tunnel leading into a skull filled with smoke and ash. It was a face that had been cooked onto the bone. The skin pulled tight and warped like melted plastic. Arthur tried to scream. He commanded his lungs to fill, his diaphragm to heave, his throat to unleash the primal animal noise of a man facing his end. He could feel the air rushing in, but the sound died before it reached his lips. His body had betrayed him. The fear was too absolute, too chemical. It severed the connection between his brain and his voice. He was frozen, a statue of terror, trapped in the passenger seat of a tomb. Then the thing carved from burns and bad memories smiled. It wasn't a human expression. The skin didn't wrinkle, it tore. The lips peeled back way too far, stretching past the jawline, snapping tight like old rubber bands. It revealed gums that had turned the color of slate and teeth black with rot. The decay of a mouth that hadn't drawn a living breath in decades. It wasn't a smile of amusement. It was the baring of fangs by a predator that had forgotten how to mimic a man. You were looking for a reaction, the thing rasped. The voice was gone now. In its place was the sound of a structure collapsing, the crackle of dry timber catching fire, the hiss of a radiator bleeding out. So here it is. And then he began to come apart. He didn't vanish in a blink, he eroded. The figure started to dissolve into the air, particle by miserable particle, slow and deliberate. He faded like a bad signal on an old television, making sure Arthur had to watch every second of his disintegration. He didn't just fade away, he unraveled. It started at the edges, the way a drop of ink blooms when it hits a glass of water. The sharp lines of his shoulders lost their structure, bleeding into the stale air of the car. Then the rest of him followed. The leather jacket, the hands on the wheel, that ruin of a face, it all lost its solidity, sublimating into a thick, swirling vapor. But this wasn't smoke. Smoke drifts aimlessly. This substance moved with intention. It had a mind. Great coils of darkness began to unwind from the driver's seat. They were blacker than the night outside, blacker than a closed grave. They didn't just exist in the shadows. They seemed to eat the light, swallowing the faint glow of the dashboard until the cabin felt suffocatingly small. It was like watching a creature from the bottom of the ocean, something born in crushing pressure and absolute cold, finally stretching out its limbs. The tendrils drifted toward Arthur with a terrifying, languid patience. They weren't in a rush. They knew he was paralyzed by fear, glued to the seat, his hand frozen on the door handle. They knew the script was ending, and they were the ones writing the finale. And then, deep inside Arthur's chest, the biological bill finally came due. His heart, the same heart his doctor had begged him to take care of, the one weakened by years of cheap fast food, constant rejection, and the grinding stress of a career that never launched, slammed shut. It wasn't a metaphor. It was a mechanical failure. The main artery, already choked by decades of plaque and disappointment, spasmed violently. The muscle constricted with a force that defied biology, squeezed tight by a terror so pure it became physical. The blockage hit with more finality than any medical diagnosis ever could. The flow of life was severed, starving a section of his heart that had been running on fumes and sheer stubbornness for 3 years. It was no longer surviving on borrowed time. The loan had been called in. Immediate catastrophic decay set in. It didn't happen cell by cell, but in devastating waves, a biological landslide. Nature was executing a shutdown sequence with terrifying speed, retiring a machine that had long outlasted its design limits. 10,000 sparks of life extinguished, then 100,000. A million microscopic failures happening all at once within his chest, each one a tiny tragedy, piling up into a singular, fatal collapse. His body had simply decided to resign from the exhausting business of being alive. Then came the detonation. Pain didn't just hurt, it erupted. It felt as though a star had gone critical behind his ribs, condensing every agony he had ever known into a single, blinding point of white heat before blowing outward. The shockwave tore down his left arm like a jagged bolt of electricity and slammed into his jaw, clamping his mouth shut with enough force to threaten the structural integrity of his teeth. It made every previous moment of suffering in his life feel trivial. Child's play compared to the torture his own anatomy could inflict when the safeguards were removed. This wasn't just pain, it was erasure. It was his physiology launching a violent mutiny against his will to survive. It was a decision that death was a mercy compared to what the encroaching shadow might do if it finished its arrival. He clawed frantically at his chest, his fingers shredding the silk of his ruined formal wear. The sticky, fake stage blood on his costume began to swirl with the cold, heavy sweat of genuine primal fear. This was mortality walking through the door like a relentless bounty hunter he had evaded for years. But the chase was over. On this desolate strip of road, there was no room to bargain, no extensions to be granted, and nowhere left to run. Air refused to enter his lungs. His vision began to vignette, the darkness closing in from the edges like rising floodwaters, or the heavy velvet curtains dropping on a final act where the theater was already empty. The lights on the dashboard smeared into meaningless streaks. The phantom smoke churned. His entire world shrank down to a single, flickering ember of awareness, fighting for purchase in a vessel that had already been scuttled. Consciousness had become a luxury his system could no longer support. The dark entity that had been at the wheel now enveloped him. It was a coldness that defied physics, stealing the last fatting warmth from his skin, carrying with it the acrid stench of burning meat and melting tires. It was the specific, hollow stench that lingers after a catastrophe. It wasn't the nostalgic smell of firewood or autumn leaves, but the foul odor of things that were never meant to be consumed by flame. It smelled of scorched organic matter, singed hair, and incinerated dreams. As the abyss swallowed him whole, Arthur's final conscious spark wasn't about his resume. It wasn't about the internet stardom that had lured him to this desolate stretch of road, nor was it about the production team hiding in the trees, staring at the feed from his hidden camera with rising panic. His last thought was far quieter, a devastating realization of his own mediocrity. I never really had the talent for this, did I? His body collapsed against the passenger glass, one hand still locked over his heart, his eyes wide and unseeing. His mouth hung open in a frozen scream that no amount of special effects makeup could replicate. It was a mask of absolute, unadulterated horror, ironically, the first truly convincing performance of his life. Dark vapor retracted, solidifying into the silhouette of a young man. The figure slid aviator shades over hollow, empty sockets and gripped the gear shift with hands that remembered the heat of fire better than the feel of a steering wheel. The engine growled deep in its throat. The transmission engaged. The vintage machine swung back onto the pavement and surged into the mist. Its taillights bled into the gray like fresh wounds, fading to faint red echoes, then to shadows, and finally into non-existence. Devon caught it first on the feed, his face bathed in the sickly blue light of the laptop screen deep within the grove where they had built their command post. "He's down," Devon whispered, leaning in until his breath fogged the display, frantically tapping the brightness keys to cut through the digital noise. He was trying to force the pixels to make sense. "Sam, he hasn't moved in 30 seconds. That's not in the script, is it?" Sam swung the long-range lens around, a piece of glass worth more than their combined rent. But the heavy fog turned the scene into a blurry watercolor, where shapes were merely suggestions of reality. The car was gone. The gravel shoulder where the vehicle had idled, where they had just filmed Arthur climbing inside, where the scene had played out moments ago, was untouched. There were no tire marks, no displaced dirt, no proof that 2 tons of American steel had ever sat there. But Arthur was there. He was lying in the drainage ditch, half buried in dry grass that had turned gold with the season. He wasn't positioned for a camera angle. He didn't look like an actor waiting for the director to yell cut. He lay with the broken, unnatural stillness of a discarded mannequin. His eyes were locked open, staring into the void with a terrifying, glassy permanence. His hand remained locked against his sternum, fingers curled inward like withered roots clawing at the damp cotton of his shirt. The fake blood, cheap syrup and red dye, had crusted over into a brownish, rusty stain. It looked disturbingly authentic under the sudden glare of the moon, which had finally pierced the fog to wash the entire scene in a grim, boneyard silver. "He's probably just committing to the bit," Devon offered, though his voice was brittle, lacking any real conviction. It was the sound of a violin string wound so tight it was seconds from snapping. "You know how he is. He's just waiting for us to yell cut. He's just acting." But Sam wasn't listening. He had already abandoned his post, leaving the expensive camera unguarded and the laptop glowing in the dirt. He hit the gravel running, his boots drumming a chaotic, panicked rhythm against the stones. It was the desperate sprint of someone realizing that a harmless film project had just curdled into a catastrophe that no amount of apologizing could fix. Devon scrambled after him a heartbeat later, slipping on the loose rocks, his breath venting in jagged white plumes that the mist devoured instantly. They skid to a halt standing over him, their momentum dying as the reality of the image hit them. Sam collapsed to his knees in the mud. It wasn't just Arthur lying there. It was a husk. The difference between a sleeping person and a corpse is written in a language that requires no translation. Sam jammed 2 fingers against the side of Arthur's neck, digging into the skin where the carotid artery should have been thumping. He found only cooling flesh and a terrifying stillness. The silence in those veins was deafening. "Phone," Sam choked out. It wasn't a shout. It was a shattered exhale, the voice of a man watching his reality dismantle itself. "Devon, call 911. Right now, call them." Devon yanked his mobile from his pocket, but his fine motor skills had evaporated. His thumb spasmed against the glass screen. 9-1-2, 941. Useless, frantic typos that wouldn't summon help or salvation. Finally, on the 4th try, he managed to punch in the sequence. The 3 digits every child is taught to memorize as the last line of defense when the world falls apart. "The car is gone," Sam whispered, his eyes lifting from the body to scan the vacant stretch of road. He pointed at the untouched shoulder, at the empty void where the Nova had been idling just seconds ago. The spot where they had both seen it. where their lenses had captured it, was vacant. "Dev, look at the ground," Sam stammered, his voice pitching up, cracking under the weight of a panic that was quickly spiraling into hysteria. "The car is gone. Where did it go? There aren't even tracks, man. Look at the gravel, it's pristine. How does a car just vanish without moving a single stone?" The dispatcher's voice on the phone was a flat line of sterile professionalism, a calm counterpoint to Devon's unraveling sanity. She asked standard protocol questions that Devon had no language for. Yes, there was an emergency. No, he couldn't explain the physics of it. The victim was his friend. Well, barely a friend, really just a guy who paid him to hold a boom mic, and now that guy was dead. "He got into a car," Devon wept into the receiver, "but the car isn't here anymore. It ceased to exist. Please just send someone." Rescue was a lifetime away. An ambulance was dispatched from Amarillo, 40 minutes of asphalt between the paramedics and the tragedy. When the lights finally cut through the fog, the EMTs would find two traumatized 20-somethings shaking over the body of a man whose heart had simply detonated. A massive myocardial infarction that had stopped him cold before he hit the ground. They would catalog the props, the fake blood, the theatrical makeup, the button camera still blinking its red recording eye in the grass. They would piece together a story of a prank video that pushed a stressed heart too far. But they would find no evidence of a vehicle, no skid marks, no oil drips, no tread patterns to corroborate the story of the vintage muscle car the boys insisted had been there. The police would take their statements with sympathetic, pitying nods. They knew how grief and darkness could play tricks on the mind out here in the Badlands. To them, the ghost car was just a hallucination born of shock. The footage on the memory card, however, would survive. It would show Arthur opening the door of a vehicle that left no physical footprint. It would capture his performance, the moment he popped the blood packet, and the moment he broke character, smiling nervously at the driver, trying to laugh it off. And then the audio would pick it up. A voice that sounded like wind hissing through a graveyard, or the crackle of dry timber catching fire. "I knew you weren't a ghost because spirits don't have a pulse, but I can hear yours hammering." The footage captured the precise millisecond Arthur's smirk dissolve. The transition from awkward comedy to primal, animalistic dread happened faster than a shutter clicked. He clawed at his sternum, oxygen abandoning him, the spark in his pupils extinguished like a match dropped in a hurricane. Then, the view tumbled. The camera hit the dirt, coming to rest sideways, recording nothing but the grainy texture of the soil and the underbelly of a night that had just claimed another victim who mistook a predator for a prop. That file never made it to the upload queue. Devon and Sam viewed it exactly one time in a locked room, shivering before wiping the drive clean. Some horrors aren't meant for the algorithm. Some nightmares shouldn't be monetized. They pawned the lenses, the mics, the tripods. They quit the industry cold turkey. Devon vanished into the anonymity of a lecture hall in Phoenix. Sam buried himself in the noise and heat of a family restaurant in Santa Fe. The subject remained a sealed tomb between them until 3 years later, fueled by open bar bourbon at Sam's reception. "Do you think he knew?" Devon mumbled, swaying slightly, his words blurring at the edges. "The driver. Do you think Arthur realized what he was sitting next to?" Sam stayed silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on his wife spinning across the dance floor, a vision of life and light in a world that usually made sense. A world where cars had mass and hearts only broke from romance, not fear. "I think he got his wish," Sam finally murmured. He went looking for the ultimate scene partner, and he found him. Someone who never breaks character. Someone committed to the role for eternity. Method acting, Devon breathed. The purest kind, Sam nodded. They drained their glasses and buried the topic forever. Route 66 remains a 2,400-mile scar of mythology carved across the American chest. Parts of it are preserved in neon amber, tourist traps selling bottled nostalgia. But other stretches are dead zones, cracked asphalt reclaiming its territory, forgotten by the maps. On nights when the cloud cover is thick and the moon is shy, travelers still report anomalies. A pristine, cherry-red muscle car gliding through the mist, chrome gleaming with an impossible luster, piloted by a silhouette in dark shades who refuses to acknowledge the living. Sometimes, they see a figure in a ruined tuxedo standing in the weeds, thumb out, face painted in the garish hues of the dead. The air fills with the sickly sweet scent of burnt sugar and scorched dreams. Most drivers don't tap the brakes. Most have the good sense to realize that not every performance requires an audience. Some scenes are best left playing out in the dark, on an empty stage, where the only applause is the wind whistling through the grass from only a distance. We usually glide past these haunted places, sealed inside our climate-controlled bubbles, protected by the sheer momentum of the modern world. We look out the window, feel a brief chill, and keep moving. But every now and then, you get a wanderer who steps on the brakes. The type of person who thinks they're the director of reality. They believe they can dip a toe into the abyss, orchestrate the scare, and then just edit out the bad parts later. But the highway is an ancient beast, and it has infinite patience. It simply opens its jaws and invites them into a narrative that was written in blood long before they were born. The story doesn't end just because you stop filming. Somewhere in that swirling fog, a boy consumed by flames 50 years ago is still shifting gears. He's navigating a midnight that never ends, collecting hitchhikers who think fear is just a genre. These are the passengers who confuse a nightmare with a special effect, who learn the hard way that the most dedicated performers don't have an off switch. He just keeps driving. He keeps perfecting his tragedy in the only theater that's always open. And then comes the twist, the moment of absolute clarity when the hitchhiker realizes the show wasn't for them. They were never the audience. They were the prop. The real audience is out there in the pitch black, watching with hollow sockets that saw the fire firsthand, long before fear became a commodity to be sold online. They watch in silence as another actor takes center stage, delivers their final, terrified monologue, and exits into the void, leaving behind nothing but the heavy silence of a heart that has finally ceased its beating. Story 2. The Scent of a Stranger. Laura jerked awake at 3:47 a.m., pulled from her dreams not by a noise, but by the atmosphere in the room. The furnace had just kicked on, humming deep in the bones of the house, and with the heat came a sickening, heavy wave of air. She lay frozen in the pitch black, her instincts screaming that something was wrong before her brain could even name it. It was a cloying, biological sweetness, the specific, heavy perfume of something that has gone bad. It smelled like fruit turning to liquid in a hot pantry, or meat forgotten in a broken freezer. It drifted from the vents, thick and suffocating, coating her bedroom in an invisible layer of decay that made her throat tight. Down the hall, a small, dry cough broke the silence. Hazel. She was awake and she was breathing it in too. Laura realized with a sinking dread that this wasn't new. She had been catching ghostly whiffs of it for 3 days now. A faint trace over her morning toast, a fleeting suggestion of it when she walked in the door after school. But she had shoved the worry down, blamming it on the damp autumn leaves outside, or the rusty plumbing, or just the general groans and smells of a home built in the 50s. A structure that required a constant mental balancing act between fix it now and ignore it until payday. But this couldn't be ignored. This was aggressive. She found Hazel sitting bolt upright in bed, clutching the duvet to her chin, her 7-year-old face a pale mask in the dim blue light of the nightlight. The girl looked at her mother with wide, terrified eyes that asked a question Laura didn't have the courage to answer. Not in the dead of night, not when she didn't know the answer herself. Laura threw the window sash up, letting the biting October wind scour the room, desperate to flush out the stench of rot. She tucked the blankets tighter around her daughter's trembling shoulders. Hazel watched her with that unnerving, primal focus that children sometimes have, the ability to sense a predator long before the adults even know they're being hunted. Laura retreated to her own room but didn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling until the gray light of dawn crept in, listening to her house exhale poison through the ductwork, trying to pinpoint the exact moment she had lost the ability to trust her own gut. The apartment downstairs had been a silent cavern for 4 months. 4 months of carrying the entire mortgage on a single teacher's salary, while her savings evaporated with terrifying speed. She spent her nights staring at spreadsheets, moving the numbers around like pieces on a game board. But the game was rigged. The math always ended in the red. The rent from the basement wasn't just nice to have. It was the firewall standing between her and losing the only stability she had managed to salvage from the divorce. So, when the notification popped up on the rental app, she had been too relieved to look at the red flags. Douglas Archer didn't have a rental history she could trace, but his direct deposits were clockwork, and a quick call to a medical supply firm confirmed he was on the payroll. But it was the phone call that really sold her. He spoke with a soft, courtly politeness that felt rare these days. When she warned him about the noise of a 7-year-old living upstairs, he had laughed gently and promised he would be a ghost. He worked graveyard shifts, he explained. No TV, no parties, just a quiet place to crash during the day. She had approved him that very night, feeling a surge of pride at her own pragmatism. The deposit hit her account 48 hours later. He moved in on a Tuesday while she was at school. She left the keys in the lockbox, just as they'd discussed. When she pulled into the driveway that evening, his car was already there, a gray sedan so painfully average it seemed to dissolve into the pavement. The door to the basement unit was shut tight. No music, no boxes being dragged across the floor. She went through the evening routine, boiling pasta, checking math homework, reading bedtime stories, trying to ignore the new, silent weight settling into the foundation of her life. And so they settled into a ghostly rhythm. For the entire first week, Douglas was less of a tenant and more of a rumor. She only knew he existed by the traces he left behind, the gray sedan gliding into the driveway at odd, lonely hours, the pale yellow square of light spilling from the basement window well, the pipes groaning behind the walls at 3:00 a.m. as water moved through the veins of the house. It felt bizarre, bordering on negligent, to share her foundation with a man she couldn't pick out of a lineup. But the check had cleared, the bank was satisfied, and she forced herself to swallow the creeping unease, replacing it with gratitude for solvency. Then came the drawing. She walked into the kitchen one afternoon to find Hazel hunched over the table, gripping a crayon with white-knuckled intensity. It was a standard kid's sketch, wobbly lines for the roof, a stick-figure oak tree, but the bottom third of the page was a disaster. Where the basement should have been, Hazel had unleashed a storm of black wax. She hadn't just colored it in. She had attacked the paper, grinding the crayon down with such violent force that she'd torn right through the fiber. Laura froze behind her daughter's chair. Hazel sensed the shadow, looked up with unreadable eyes, and then quietly slid to the floor, abandoning the artwork without a word to disappear into the living room. The drawing lay on the table like a threat. Laura stared at that jagged, gaping void, that violent erasure of the space beneath their feet, and shoved it deep into a drawer. She told herself it was just childhood anxiety, just a mood, just a phase. Everything is fine. But the house had a different opinion. On the 8th day, the smell returned with a vengeance. Laura was folding towels in the upstairs hall when it hit her, a thick, cloying wave of sweetness that made her stomach turn. It wasn't fatting this time. It pulsed in time with the furnace, breathing into the room, intensifying and receding but never leaving. It was the undeniable scent of biology failing, the smell of fruit dissolving into black mush, of meat left to spoil in the dark. It was the perfume of entropy. That night after Hazel was asleep, Laura went downstairs. She couldn't ignore it anymore. She knocked firmly on the hollow corridor. Silence stretched out, thick and heavy. She was about to knock again when the lock tumbled. The door cracked open just a few inches, revealing a sliver of a face in the gloom. He was younger than she had imagined, maybe mid-30s, with hair combed too neatly, and a face so aggressively average it was almost impossible to focus on. He was pleasant, bland, the kind of man who dissolves into the background of a photograph. She asked him about the smell. He didn't blink. He offered a smile that was perfectly calibrated, apologetic, slightly sheepish, and terrifyingly rational. Yes, he'd smelled it too, he admitted. Something had likely crawled into the crawl space behind his closet and died, but he was taking care of it. That phrase stuck in her throat like a fishbone, taking care of it, as if a decomposing animal in the walls was a minor administrative task rather than a biohazard. When she insisted on calling an exterminator, he deflected with a terrifyingly polite refusal. No need to spend the money. He had it under control. He closed the door with a gentle click, and Laura was left standing in the hallway, staring at the grain of the wood. The interaction felt rehearsed. It was the way he filled the doorframe, not aggressive, but absolute. His body was a soft wall, blocking any view of the life he was living down there. "It's your house," a voice whispered in her head. "Open the door." But the lease was a legal shield, and the doubt was a heavy weight. She felt the old, familiar shame of her marriage creeping back in, her ex-husband's voice telling her she was hysterical, that she invented crises just to feel important. "Don't be crazy, Laura. It's just a dead mouse." She retreated upstairs and tried to lose herself in work, staring at a stack of 10th grade essays. But the words on the page dissolved into nonsense. She read the same sentence 5 times, her brain looping back to that polite, empty smile and the finality of the latch sliding home. The stench didn't fade, it metastasized. By the weekend, the odor had colonized the house. It wasn't just in the air anymore. It felt like it had seeped into the drywall, the sofa cushions, the very fibers of her clothes. She bought heavy-duty plug-ins, blasting the house with synthetic lavender, but the result was nauseating, a sickly, cloying mix of chemical flowers and rotting meat. At the kitchen table, Hazel pushed her cereal bowl away, her face pale. She couldn't eat. That was the breaking point. The smell unlocked a memory Laura had buried deep. The air in her mother's house 3 years ago, days after the end. It was the specific, heavy sweetness of biology breaking down, the scent of a human body betraying its owner. That night, Laura didn't tap on the basement door. She hammered on it. The knob turned instantly. He hadn't been walking to the door. He had been standing right behind it, waiting. This time, the door swung wider. For a split second, she saw past him. The apartment was sterile. It didn't look tidy, it looked scrubbed. There was no clutter, no personality, just a terrifying, empty cleanliness that suggested evidence had been removed rather than chores done. "It's getting worse," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "Whatever is down there has to go. If you don't call someone today, I'm calling them myself." His pleasant expression didn't flicker, but the temperature behind his eyes dropped. It was a micro-expression, a cold, rapid calculation, like a predator sizing up a threat. Then, the mask reset. He explained calmly that the access panel was blocked by heavy boxes he hadn't unpacked yet. It wasn't a refusal, just a delay. He told her it wasn't a 5-minute fix. The access panel, he claimed, was buried behind a wall of heavy moving boxes he hadn't touched since arriving. He needed a solid block of time to excavate the closet. Sunday was the earliest he could manage. Laura wanted to scream, to demand he move the boxes now, but the crushing weight of exhaustion and the polite legalities of the lease held her back. She drew a hard line in the sand instead. "Monday," she said. "If the smell isn't gone by Monday morning, I am hiring a professional crew, and the bill is coming out of your security deposit." He nodded, that synthetic smile anchored in place. "Understood, Mrs. Cutler." The way he said it made her skin crawl. He refused to use her first name, even though she had offered it a dozen times. "Mrs. Cutler." It didn't sound like respect. It sounded like a label. It sounded like he was categorizing her. She retreated to the main floor and did something she had never done in the history of owning the house. She threw the heavy deadbolt on the door that led down to the basement stairs. The loud clack of the metal sliding home felt absurd. She was locking herself inside her own home against a man whose only crime was procrastination. But as soon as the lock engaged, her breathing slowed. That night she stood in the doorway of Hazel's room, watching the soft rise and fall of her daughter's chest in the amber glow of the nightlight. The suffocating pressure of being the sole provider, the sole protector, slammed into her. There was no backup. There was no one to tag in. If she miscalculated the danger, if she missed a sign, the cost would be absolute. Saturday broke with a suffocating, wet grayness, the kind of heavy, humid atmosphere that screams of an approaching storm. Laura woke up sweating, shaken by the fragments of a nightmare she couldn't quite catch. It was just a lingering sensation of violation, of something alien occupying a space where it didn't belong. She lay still, listening. The house groaned, but the basement was dead silent. A quick glance out the window confirmed it. The gray sedan was gone. She forced herself to shower and dress, then scraped together a breakfast Hazel wouldn't eat. Her daughter sat at the table, poking listlessly at her eggs. The dark circles under the 7-year-old's eyes were deepening into bruises. When Laura asked how she slept, Hazel just shrugged, muttering about bad feelings. Laura bit her tongue. She wanted to explain that feelings aren't facts, that nightmares can't hurt you, but she knew better. Children live in the raw current of intuition. They don't need evidence to know when the air has turned poisonous. She drove Hazel to a friend's house for a playdate, relieved to get her child out of the blast zone for a few hours. But on the drive back, Laura didn't turn toward home. She pulled into the hardware store parking lot. She marched down the aisles and filled a basket with purpose. Industrial-strength contractor bags, thick chemical-grade rubber gloves, and a high-filtration face mask. She was gearing up for war, not a cleanup. The cashier, a bored teenager with smudged eyeliner, scanned the respirator mask and heavy-duty gloves, shooting Laura a look that was half pity, half confusion, but she didn't ask questions. When Laura pulled back into her driveway, the dread returned instantly. His car was there. She hauled her supplies inside, dumping them near the basement door like ammunition crates, then stood in the kitchen, gripping a mug of coffee that was rapidly turning cold. She stared out the window at the driveway, her mind snagging on something she couldn't quite articulate. The car, what was it about that damn car? It was a gray sedan with local plates, utterly boring, but why was it a blind spot in her memory? She saw it every single day, yet if a police officer asked her for the make or model, she would draw a blank. It was like her brain simply refused to save the file. It was just a car-shaped object, just like Douglas was a person-shaped object. Her mind spiraled back to their first phone call. She replayed the audio in her head. His voice had been so reassuring, warm, articulate, safe. He made a self-deprecating joke about the monotony of selling medical supplies, and she remembered laughing. He asked all the right questions about the school district and the street parking. He mentioned growing up in Meridian and how good it felt to be home after years away. It had been a 20-minute conversation that left her feeling like she'd won the tenant lottery. Finally, someone stable. But now, in the silence of her kitchen, the details were dissolving like cotton candy in water. Which company did he say he worked for? She knew he'd said the name, she'd even written it down, but she couldn't recall it. Where had he lived before moving back? Had he even said? Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her. She rushed to her home office and ripped the file folder open. Douglas Archer, DOB, March 15, 1989. Employer, Meridian Medical Supply Solutions. She scanned down to the rental history. Previous address, an apartment complex in Jackson. But the landlord reference section was blank. She remembered his email explaining it away. He'd been living with a girlfriend. Her name was on the lease. Things ended badly. It had sounded reasonable a week ago. Now, it just looked like a gap in the fence where a wolf could slip through. Her eyes drifted to the corner of the desk. Hazel's drawing was still there. The sketch of the house with the basement obliterated by black crayon. Hazel had muttered something under her breath when she drew it. The wrong man. Not Mr. Archer, not the new neighbor, the wrong man. It was as if her 7-year-old daughter, with her unfiltered intuition, had picked up on a frequency Laura was too busy to hear. She had sensed a glitch in reality, someone occupying a space they had no right to be in. At the time, Laura had filed it under overactive imagination. Now, looking at that jagged black void, it felt less like a drawing and more like a warning shot. Laura turned back to her laptop. She typed Meridian Medical Supply Solutions into the search bar. A website materialized. It looked legitimate at first glance. Clean layout, stock photos of diverse doctors smiling over clipboards, a catalog of sterile equipment. The phone number on the contact page matched the one on Douglas's application perfectly. She remembered dialing it for the reference check. The person on the other line had been brief, sounding bored and bureaucratic, confirming Douglas Archer was a sales rep. It had been a 30-second call. On a hunch that felt more like a compulsion, she dialed the number again. It rang 4 times, then a click. You have reached Meridian Medical Supply Solutions. Our office hours are Monday through Friday, 8:00 a.m. to 5:00 p.m. Please leave a message. She hung up. She checked her watch. 2:47 p.m. Saturday. Okay, fair enough. They're closed on the weekend. That's normal. That's reasonable. But then a thought snagged. Don't medical suppliers have on-call lines? Hospitals don't stop needing catheters and syringes just because it's Saturday. Shouldn't there be an emergency extension? She dialed again. This time she left a message trying to force her voice into a casual, breezy tone. Hi, this is Laura Cutler. I'm just updating some file info for Douglas Archer's lease. Give me a ring back when you can. Thanks. She ended the call and immediately felt ridiculous. What was she doing? Playing detective. She had already done this. She had checked the boxes. She was spiraling, inventing conspiracies because she was stressed about a dead rat in the wall. But then the smell drifted up from the floorboards, heavy and accusing, and the feeling of absurdity vanished. She spent the rest of the afternoon frantically cleaning. She scrubbed tile grout that was already white. She reorganized the pantry by expiration date. She needed physical exhaustion to drown out the noise in her head. At 4:00 p.m., she picked up Hazel. Her daughter was bubbling over with stories from the playdate, full of life and color, as if escaping the house had refilled her battery. But the moment they turned onto their street, the light went out. Hazel went silent mid-sentence. Her energy evaporated. As they pulled into the driveway, the child stared at the house through the glass, her small knuckles turning white as she gripped the seatbelt. Laura saw the reluctance in her daughter's body language and made a command decision. They weren't going home yet. Instead, they retreated to a pizza joint on Main Street, seeking refuge in the noise and grease. They sat in a booth by the window, bathed in the safety of neon lights and other people's conversations. Hazel, who hadn't touched food in days, suddenly devoured 3 slices and 2 sodas, her color returning with every bite. Laura watched her, sipping water, acting the part of the calm, collected mother. She was trying desperately to filter out her own paranoia, to be the barrier between her child and the creeping dread. But the reprieve had an expiration date. When they finally turned back into their driveway, the heaviness hit them both like a physical blow. It wasn't a supernatural chill. It was a feeling of displacement. As they walked to the front door, Laura felt like an intruder in her own life. The house no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a biological organism that was tolerating them, waiting for them to leave so it could get back to its real business. That night, Laura didn't sleep. She sat in the living room with every single light blazing, acting as a sentry. She audited the silence. The house groaned and settled, but beneath the familiar sound, she heard him. The hum of his refrigerator, the rush of water in the pipes, and once the distinct rhythmic thud of packing, back and forth, back and forth. At midnight, the engine turned over. She moved to the window, peering through the slats of the blinds. The sedan backed out, headlights sweeping across the lawn like searchlights before disappearing into the void. For the first time, her brain actually registered the vehicle, a Toyota Camry. It was so obvious now. Why had it been invisible to her before? It was as if a mental fog had momentarily lifted, allowing her to see the details she had been subconsciously blocking out. She performed a perimeter check, testing every deadbolt twice, then forced herself into bed. But her mind was a projector playing a loop of horrors. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about the crawl space. She tried to imagine what kind of animal takes a week to rot. She dissected Douglas's smile, realizing now that it never reached his eyes. It was just a manipulation of facial muscles, a mask worn by something that didn't know how to be human. Then at 2:00 a.m., reality snapped. Creaking. It came from the hallway, just outside her bedroom door. Laura froze, her breath catching in a throat that had gone instantly dry. It wasn't the house settling. It was weight. It was compression. Creak. It came again, slow, deliberate, the sound of someone trying to move in silence and failing. Her hand lashed out for the nightstand, fingers fumbling for her phone. She punched in 911, her thumb hovering, trembling over the call button, but paralysis set in. What was the script here? I heard a noise. The dispatcher would ask if she had checked. The police would ask if she saw an intruder. If she called and the hall was empty, she was just the hysterical divorcee hearing things in the night. She would be humiliated. But if she didn't call? But then the sound moved. The footsteps didn't come closer. They retreated, shuffling down the hall toward Hazel's room. That broke the paralysis. The fear evaporated, replaced instantly by a primal, violent instinct. Laura didn't think, she moved. She snatched the aluminum baseball bat from the back of the closet, a relic her ex-husband had left behind, and ripped her bedroom door open. The hallway was a tunnel of shadows, illuminated only by the faint, amber spill of the nightlight from Hazel's doorway. It was empty. Laura sprinted down the corridor, weapon raised, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She burst into her daughter's room. Hazel was curled up in a tangle of blankets, breathing deeply, completely undisturbed. Laura did a tactical sweep of the house. Upstairs, downstairs, closets, corners. She checked every window latch and every deadbolt. The house was sealed tight. The door leading to the basement was still locked from her side, the bolt engaged exactly as she had left it, outside. The driveway was empty. The car was still gone. There was no intruder, just the house, the silence, and the smell. She didn't go back to bed. She sat on the middle step of the staircase, the bat resting across her knees like a sword, and stared at the front door until the sun began to bleach the windows gray. When Hazel shuffled into the kitchen at 7:00 a.m., Laura was standing at the stove, flipping pancakes with a cheerful energy that felt like a lie. "Sleep okay?" she chirped, the performance straining her face. "Uh-huh," Hazel mumbled, rubbing her eyes. "You." "Like a log." They ate breakfast in the heavy silence of the kitchen, and Laura made a choice. It was Sunday. The grace period was over. Today, the wall came down. She was going to stand there and watch him clear that crawl space, and if he stalled again, she was going in herself. At 9:00 a.m., she marched downstairs and pounded on the apartment door. The gray sedan was back in the driveway. He was home. He had to be. She knocked again, shouting his name. Silence. She tried the knob, but it was locked tight. She waited. An hour dragged by, then 2. At 11:00, she dialed his cell. It rang and rang until the robotic voicemail kicked in, asking her to leave a message. She hung up. By noon, the anxiety had hardened into a cold, vibrating anger. She had been polite. She had been accommodating. She had let this stranger fill her home with the stench of death while her daughter slept in fear. He was hiding down there like a sullen teenager. She marched to her office and dug out the lease. The legalese was clear. The landlord had the right to enter for emergency repairs. A biological hazard permeating the ventilation system wasn't just a repair. It was a crisis. She wasn't invading his privacy. She was saving her house. But there was a problem, the door. It had a keyed deadbolt. When he moved in, she had handed over both copies of the key in a gesture of misguided trust. She had wanted to show him she respected his boundaries. Now, that respect felt like negligence. "Wait, the lockbox." She had left the keys in the real estate lockbox on the porch railing for his move-in day. He was supposed to grab them, let himself in, and that was that. But she still had the master key for the box itself. She rummaged through the kitchen junk drawer, pushing aside expired coupons and loose batteries until her fingers closed around the small brass key. She walked out to the porch, the noon sun glaring off the metal box. She dialed in the combination, Hazel's birthday, and the shackle popped open. The keys were still there. They were sitting exactly where she had left them 10 days ago. The air left her lungs. If the keys were still here, he had never picked them up, which meant he had never used a key to enter the apartment. She stared at the metal in her hand, her brain trying to reject the implication. How had he been getting in? A strange, cold calm settled over her. It was the clarity of adrenaline. She walked back inside, pocketed the keys, and called Hazel into the living room. "Honey," she said, her voice steady but leaving no room for argument. "You're going to Hannah's house, right now." Hazel looked up wide-eyed. "Why?" "I'm calling her mom. You're going to have a sleepover. It'll be fun." "Is something wrong?" "No," Laura lied, smoothing her daughter's hair. "Nothing's wrong. I just have some boring house stuff to fix, and it's going to smell really bad when I open up that wall. I don't want you breathing it in." That logic landed. Hazel ran to pack her bag. Laura made the call to Hannah's mother, putting on her best cheery neighbor voice. "Just a pest control issue," she explained. "Toxic fumes. Could Hazel crash for the night?" The yes came quickly, almost too enthusiastically, a relief that made Laura's chest ache. 20 minutes later, Hazel was in the backseat of the neighbor's minivan, and Laura was alone in the kitchen, gripping the brass keys until they bit into her palm. The house suddenly felt enormous. The silence wasn't empty. It was heavy, expectant, like the air before a lightning strike. She pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, then typed quickly. "Going into the basement to confront the tenant about the smell. He's been acting weird. If I don't text you in 20 minutes, call the police." She hit send before she could feel stupid, before the voice in her head could tell her she was being dramatic. The reply pinged back instantly. "Will do, be careful." 20 minutes, the clock was running. She snapped on the thick rubber gloves, leaving the respirator on the counter for now. She needed to breathe the air first. She needed to know. She walked to the basement door, threw the bolt, and slid the key into the deadbolt. It turned with a smooth, heavy clunk. The door swung open. Below her, the stairs vanished into a throat of darkness. She slapped the wall switch, and the basement was instantly washed in the cold, clinical glare of fluorescent tubes. The smell rushed up the stairs like a physical wave. It was dense, suffocating, a wall of putrefaction that made her gag. It was worse than she had feared, worse than dead rats, worse than the memory of her mother's room. It was the thick, sweet stench of liquefied meat mixed with the sharp burn of industrial bleach. She pulled her shirt up over her nose and forced herself down the steps. The apartment was exactly as she had seen it through the crack in the door, terrifyingly sterile. There was no furniture, just a cheap folding table and a single metal chair. In the corner, a sleeping bag was rolled out on the floor, ignoring the bed frame she had provided. The walls were bare. No photos, no books, no signs of a human life except for one lone cardboard box in the corner. The closet door was shut. The smell was radiating from behind it like heat from an oven. Laura crossed the room, her legs feeling numb, disconnected, as if she were controlling an avatar in a video game. She reached out. Her gloved hand gripped the knob. It turned, the door swung wide. The stench slammed into her, violent and blinding. She stumbled back, retching, her eyes watering uncontrollably. Through the blur of tears, she saw. On the floor of the closet lay a shape wrapped tightly in layers of translucent plastic sheeting. It was undeniably, horribly, the size of a human body. The plastic sarcophagus had failed. It had split open under the pressure of the gases expanding inside, and through the jagged tears, she saw skin that had turned the color of a bruised plum. This wasn't a dead rat. This wasn't faulty plumbing. Her brain tried to short circuit, desperate to reject the data, but the evidence was screaming at her. There was a human corpse rotting in her basement closet. Every instinct shouted run, but her legs had turned to leap. Instead of fleeing, a morbid, terrible gravity pulled her closer. The face was obscured by the wrapping, but she saw a patch of dark hair. A man. He was dressed in jeans and a dress shirt that was no longer white. And there, peeking through a rip in the sheeting, was a wrist bearing a watch. It was a cheap, battered timepiece with a worn leather strap. The sight of it unlocked a memory, a flash of recognition that hit her like a physical blow. A vibration in her pocket shattered the moment. Her phone. She fished it out with trembling fingers. A notification from a number she didn't know lit up the gloom. "Don't scream, turn around." She whipped around. He was standing at the foot of the stairs. The polite, boring man who paid his rent on time was gone. In his place stood a predator, his expression stripped of all humanity, leaving only a cold, predatory focus. He held a kitchen knife at his side, not waving it, just holding it like an extension of his arm. "You really should have waited," he said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I had the trunk prepped to move him tonight." Laura's thumb hovered over the emergency dial, but he shook his head. It was a subtle, almost disappointed movement. He explained that he was faster than her connection speed, and there were plenty of sharp, heavy objects within arm's reach before the police could even pick up. He gestured vaguely at the workbench, then began to speak, unraveling the lie. The real Douglas Archer, the man in the closet, had been pathetically easy to erase. They met for coffee to discuss the lease. One spiked drink later, the man was pliable, confused. The imposter had walked him right into the basement, right under Laura's feet, while she was upstairs reading bedtime stories. He didn't kill him immediately, he explained. He needed the data first. He spent days extracting the biography, the hometown in Meridian, the job details, the ex-girlfriend's name. Every story he had told Laura during their interview was true. They just belonged to the man dying in the closet. He had harvested the man's life before ending it. Laura's eyes darted around the room, hunting for a weapon, an exit, a miracle. But the basement windows were barely large enough for a cat, let alone a woman. The only way out was the staircase, and the monster wearing a dead man's name was blocking the path. He continued speaking with the casual annoyance of a contractor, discussing a botched renovation. "I wrapped him tight," he murmured, glancing at the closet. "Usually that grade of polyethylene holds for weeks, but I didn't account for the Mississippi humidity. It accelerates the breakdown. I'm used to working in the north. The cold preserves things better." Laura's hand was behind her back, her thumb trembling against the glass of her screen. She slid the phone unlocked, feeling the haptic vibration. The emergency dialer was open. She just needed 1 second, one movement to connect to the outside world. She needed to make sure they could hear the end of her life. He turned his gaze back to her, and the detached professionalism vanished, replaced by a promise of violence. "I'm going to kill you," he stated flatly. "But not right this second, it's too messy. People know you're here. Your daughter is expecting you." He outlined her future with terrifying precision. It wouldn't be a knife, it would be the furnace, a faulty heat exchanger. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, and painless. She and Hazel would simply go to sleep one night and forget to wake up. And he would be the devastatingly heartbroken tenant who found the bodies. He would cry to the press. He would tell the detectives how Mrs. Cutler had been complaining about headaches, how she had meant to get the system checked but never got around to it. It would go down in the books as a tragic domestic accident, not a homicide. "But what about him?" she shouted, forcing her voice to echo off the concrete walls. "They'll find the body." "He'll be gone by sunrise," the man replied, checking his watch. "There's a flooded quarry 40 miles east. It's deep. He'll sink." Laura's thumb mashed the call button. She felt the phone buzz as the line connected. She let it slip from her sweaty palm, dropping it onto the concrete behind her, and then she started screaming. She yelled that she had checked his references, that she had called his job. She was broadcasting her testimony to the dispatcher on the floor. He laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "You called a burner phone, Laura. You spoke to a recording I made. The website, I coded it in an hour. Meridian Medical doesn't exist. Douglas Archer doesn't exist. He's just ink on a page." He took a step closer, and for the first time his eyes lit up. This wasn't just business anymore. He was enjoying the reveal. "I didn't pick this house by accident," he whispered. "I've been watching you for 6 months. I know your roots. I know you drink your coffee black because you're afraid of the calories. I know you take sedatives on Sunday nights because the anxiety of the work week keeps you up. And I know your deepest fear is ending up exactly like your mother, rotting in a room for days before anyone notices you're gone." He was savoring the terror, drinking it in. But then a sound cut through the monologue, faint, tinny, and beautiful. 911. What is the address of your emergency?" His eyes snapped down to the phone on the floor. Laura didn't hesitate. She didn't think. She launched herself into the void. Thinking wasn't an option. Instinct took the wheel. She lunged sideways, snatching a heavy framing hammer from the workbench. With a guttural scream, she hurled it at him. It clipped his shoulder. A glancing blow, not a bone breaker, but enough to make him stumble back a step. She bolted. She hit the stairs on all fours, scrambling upward, screaming her address at the top of her bleeding lungs. She screamed about the body, the knife, the carbon monoxide. She needed every word on the recording. A hand clamped around her ankle like a bear trap. She was yanked backward, her chin slamming into the edge of a step. Pain exploded in her jaw, and her mouth filled with the metallic taste of blood. He dragged her down, his grip crushing, but she thrashed like a wild animal. Her heel connected with his face, a solid, sickening crunch of cartilage. He grunted in pain, but didn't release her. She twisted around, looking up into the face of death. The knife was raised high, poised for the final stroke. She threw her arms up, a useless shield against the steel coming down. Boom! The door at the top of the stairs burst open, slamming against the wall with enough force to crack the plaster. Police, drop the weapon now. The command was thunderous, filling the stairwell. The tenant froze, the knife hesitating in midair. Laura didn't waste the nanosecond of shock. She kicked free and clawed her way up the remaining steps, pulling herself over the threshold. Strong hands grabbed her, hauling her out of the line of fire and shoving her behind a wall of blue uniforms. She collapsed on the kitchen floor, gasping for air. surrounded by a phalanx of officers with weapons drawn, all trained on the darkness below. She didn't see him surrender. She was being hustled away, voices asking if she was stabbed, if she could breathe. But she heard it, the metallic clatter of the knife hitting the concrete floor. Then came the heavy thud of boots descending, shouted orders, and the ratcheting sound of handcuffs locking tight. A blanket was draped over her shoulders. She was vibrating, her teeth chattering so hard she couldn't speak. A female officer, Officer Dawson, the name tag said, was kneeling in front of her, speaking in a low, grounding voice. "Where is your daughter, Laura? Is she here?" "Hannah's," Laura choked out, giving the address through numb lips. "She's safe." Outside the window, the world was flashing red and blue. The neighbors were on their lawns, staring at the spectacle. Her private nightmare had become public property. Then they brought him up. He was shackled, flanked by two large officers. The generic, boring tenant was gone. His face was a blank slate devoid of humanity. As they marched him past the kitchen, he paused. He lifted his head and locked eyes with her. There was no anger, no fear, no guilt, just a mild, annoyed disappointment. He looked like a man whose chess game had been interrupted by a fire alarm. "The quarry," he said, his voice flat and conversational. 40 miles northeast. You should check the bottom. Douglas has company down there." And then he was gone, shoved into the back of a cruiser. Laura was left in the wreckage of her home, answering questions she barely understood. The basement was no longer a part of her home. It was a forensic laboratory. Men in white Tyvek suits moved in and out, the strobe light flash of their cameras cutting through the gloom, documenting the horror she had lived above. Officer Dawson stuck to Laura's side like a bodyguard. She filled in the gaps of the rescue. The neighbor hadn't hesitated. The second the 20-minute deadline expired, she made the call. When the patrol units arrived, the front door was unlocked and the screaming was audible from the street. It was a matter of seconds, Dawson explained. The difference between a rescue mission and a body recovery. But the logic didn't stop the guilt from eating Laura alive. She felt stupid. She felt reckless. She had invited a predator into her sanctuary because the math on her mortgage statement was scary. She had looked at a polite mask and ignored the monster beneath it because she needed the rent money. She had traded her daughter's safety for a deposit check. They found the real Douglas Archer's wallet in the imposter's pocket. The victim was carried out the back door in a heavy black body bag while Laura stared at the living room carpet, refusing to look, refusing to give the nightmare a visual. In the cardboard box downstairs, they found the tenant's real ID. Frank Sutherland, 42 years old, wanted in 3 states. When Dawson looked up his file on the squad car computer, her face went carefully blank, the practiced neutrality of a cop seeing something that would haunt her nightmares. "You can't stay here," Dawson said gently. The house was an active crime scene. Laura nodded numbly. She had already mentally struck the match. She was never coming back. She would sell it for scraps, let the bank foreclose, walk away. It didn't matter. She couldn't live inside walls that remembered the smell of death. She couldn't sleep in a place where the noises in the night might be the furnace, or might be a killer waiting for the lock to turn. She packed a single bag under police supervision. A change of clothes, important papers, and Hazel's favorite worn-out stuffed rabbit. She left everything else. The furniture, the clothes, the life she had built. It was all contaminated. Dawson drove her to the neighbor's house personally. The cruiser was quiet, the radio chatter a low hum in the background. Halfway there, Laura asked the question that made her blood run cold. The quarry, did he say how many? Dawson hesitated, her eyes fixed on the asphalt ahead. Dive teams are heading out there now, but with a profile like Sutherland, and what we found in that box. She trailed off, then finished softly. We're not looking for just one, Laura. The rest of the drive passed in a heavy silence. When they pulled up to the curb, Laura looked through the warm glow of the neighbor's front window. Hazel was there, sitting on the floor, laughing at a board game. She looked happy. She looked oblivious. She was safe. Laura watched her daughter for a long moment, the tears finally spilling over. The world was full of monsters wearing human faces and darkness that lived under the floorboards. But tonight, on this side of the glass, the light still held. Dawson pressed a small, stiff card into her hand. It was the contact info for a victim advocate, a promise of therapy, of support systems, of someone to help navigate the wreckage. Laura took it, her fingers numb, and stepped out onto the curb. Before she could even reach for the doorbell, the door flew open. Hannah's mother stood there, her face a map of terrified questions, but Laura walked right past her. She didn't have the words yet. The story of the basement, the smell, and the monster living beneath her floorboards would have to wait. Right now, she just needed to touch reality. She dropped to her knees and pulled Hazel into a crushingly tight hug. She buried her face in her daughter's hair, inhaling deep. It didn't smell like rot or chemicals. It smelled like cheap strawberry shampoo and childhood. It smelled like life. Against every probability, against her own blind spots and mistakes, they were still breathing. That night, Laura lay on the neighbor's couch, keeping a vigil while Hazel slept safely in the guest room upstairs. But sleep was a trap. The moment she drifted off, the nightmare began. She was back on the phone, listening to that first interview. She heard Douglas Archer's voice, warm, polite, eager to please. But then the audio would distort, the warmth stripping away to reveal the flat, dead drone of Frank Sutherland. She watched in her dream as he put on Douglas's life like a stolen coat, buttoning it up to hide the emptiness underneath. She woke up gasping, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The business card sat on the coffee table in the moonlight. On the back, in blue ballpoint pen, Dawson had scrawled a 24-hour crisis line in 3 words: "You're not alone." But looking around the dark living room, Laura felt a profound, aching isolation. It settled in her marrow. It wasn't just fear. It was the total demolition of her worldview. She had lost the basic luxury of assuming people were who they said they were. She had to rebuild her entire concept of trust from zero. The phone rang at dawn. It was Dawson. The news was grim. The dive team had pulled 3 bodies from the quarry so far, and they were still searching. Sutherland was sitting in interrogation, stone silent, but his trail was loud. He was a ghost who moved across state lines, a parasite who fed on identities. Douglas Archer was just the latest skin he had worn. The pattern was always the same. Find a target who is isolated, learn their routine, consume their life, and wait for the next host. "Why me?" Laura whispered into the phone. "Why did he pick my house?" Dawson's pause was heavy. "It was your listing, Laura. We found the cached page. You wrote, 'Quiet basement suite, separate entrance, female landlord, single mother.' You thought you were advertising for a safe, low-key tenant, but to a predator like him, you were ringing a dinner bell. You painted a picture of vulnerability, and he walked right through the door." Laura wanted to argue. She wanted to scream that she was just being honest, just trying to find a good fit. But the words died in her throat. She realized with a sick clarity that honesty is a luxury for the safe. In the wild, it's just a way to show the wolf exactly where your throat is. Laura tried to apologize for simply existing, for trying to pay her bills, but Dawson stopped her. "It wasn't a mistake, Laura. It was biology," the detective said, her voice cutting through the self-loathing. "He's a shark. You don't blame the water for the shark being there. If he hadn't found your door, he would have found another one. He would have found the next lonely person, the next unlocked window." Was past tense. Frank Sutherland was in irons now, en route to a federal cage where the sun would never touch him again. But knowing that didn't bring Laura any peace. It just left her with a hollow, vibrating exhaustion and the sickening realization that right now, phones were ringing in other living rooms. Other families were being told that the search was over and that their missing sons and brothers were being pulled from the bottom of a quarry. 3 weeks later, Laura signed the closing papers on the house. She took a financial bloodbath on the deal. The buyers knew the history and squeezed her for it, but she didn't care. She would have paid them to take the keys. She used the remaining cash to lease a unit in a fortress of an apartment complex. It had 24-hour security, cameras in the lobby, and a doorman who checked IDs. It was a sterile, safe box where she and Hazel could try to remember how to breathe. Hazel recovered with that terrifying, beautiful elasticity that only children possess. She had a few nightmares, asked a few hard questions about the bad man, but mostly, she was just happy to be somewhere where the air didn't smell like decay. She bounced back. Laura didn't. She found herself staring at people too long, the grocery store clerk, the other parents at drop-off, her new neighbors. She was scanning for the glitch. She was hunting for the crack in the porcelain, the smile that was too symmetrical, the eyes that were just a little too empty. But that was the torture of it. Most people didn't have a tell. Most people were just people, messy, genuine, harmless. The problem was that the monsters looked exactly like them. You couldn't spot the wolf until its teeth were already in your throat. She spent her nights thinking about the real Douglas Archer. She tried to picture his final days. He was probably tired, broke, sleeping on couches, desperate for a break. He must have felt such relief when Frank Sutherland bought him that coffee. He probably thought, finally, a friend. Finally, a bit of luck. He didn't know that his hunger for connection was the very thing that would kill him. The final count at the quarry was 8. 8 people pulled from the cold water. 8 drifters, dreamers, and lonely souls who had slipped through the cracks of the world. They were people who had been isolated enough to trust a stranger, desperate enough to believe a lie. Frank Sutherland wasn't a mastermind. He wasn't brilliant. He was just a void. He was a hollowed-out shell of a human being who had learned that the easiest way to have a life was to simply steal one. He understood the one terrible truth that Laura would never forget. If you stand still long enough and look vulnerable enough, eventually, something will come out of the dark to claim you. Sutherland had been practicing his craft for at least 10 years, perhaps longer. He never broke his silence, never offered a manifesto or a reason. He simply let the mountain of evidence do the talking. Laura took the stand. She sat in the sterile light of the courtroom and relived the timeline, the interview, the stench of the furnace, the terrifying moment the plastic sheeting tore open. Frank Sutherland sat at the defense table, watching her with the same hollow, bored expression he had worn in her basement. He didn't flinch as she described the knife or his promise to wipe her family from existence. The jury didn't hesitate. They buried him under consecutive life sentences. He would die in a cage. When the gavel came down, Laura waited for the wave of relief, but it never came. There was no cinematic moment of closure. There was just a dull, heavy exhaustion, a simple acknowledgement that the animal was caged, and the long, painful road of healing had to start. But healing turned out to be a brutal process. She went to therapy, swallowed the pills her doctor gave her, and tried to perform normalcy for Hazel. But the shadow didn't leave. It lived in the rituals, checking the deadbolt 3 times, then 4. It lived in the way she scanned every new face for a lie. It lived in the panic that seized her chest every time she saw a gray sedan in traffic, even though she knew that 99% of them were driven by harmless people. 6 months after the verdict, she tried to step back into the world. A colleague, a man she had known for years, a kind, patient teacher, asked her to dinner. She finally said yes. They sat in a warm Italian bistro, drinking wine and talking about lesson plans and summer breaks. He was charming. He was funny. He seemed real. But Laura spent the entire 2 hours dissecting him. She wasn't listening to his stories. She was auditing them. She watched his eyes when he laughed, looking for the deadness behind the pupils. She analyzed his anecdotes about his childhood, wondering if they were truly his or if he had stolen them from a victim he buried in a crawl space. When he walked her to her car and gently asked if she wanted to do this again, she shut him down. "No," she said. She saw the sting of rejection in his eyes, the confusion, but she couldn't explain it to him. She couldn't tell him that it wasn't his fault. It was hers. Her radar was broken. She had lost the ability to trust her own gut, and the terror of making another mistake was stronger than the loneliness. She drove home in silence, locked the door of her fortress 3 times, and went straight to Hazel's room. She stood over her sleeping daughter, listening to the steady rhythm of her breath, grateful for the safety, but knowing that the part of her that used to believe in the goodness of strangers had been left behind in that basement, buried in the dark with the things that rot. She stood in the doorway of her daughter's room, a silent ghost watching the rise and fall of a small chest. Hazel slept with the heavy, dreamless peace of the innocent, unaware of just how paper-thin the wall is between a normal Tuesday and total annihilation. She didn't know how easily a soft, well-spoken voice could hide a butcher's heart. The irony was bitter enough to choke on. Laura had fought tooth and nail to keep that house. She had taken on a tenant to save their sanctuary, to prove she could provide stability after the divorce. And in doing so, she had almost invited their executioner inside. She brewed a cup of tea she didn't intend to drink and sat by the window, keeping watch over the parking lot. At midnight, headlights swept across the glass. A gray sedan turned in. Laura's heart seized. The ceramic mug rattled against her teeth. For a split second, she was back in the basement, the smell of rot filling her nose. Then the car door opened, and the young couple from Unit 3B stepped out, laughing, carrying grocery bags. Just neighbors, just a car. She forced her pulse to slow down. Not everyone is a hunter, she told herself. Most people are just trying to get home. But that was the poison Sutherland had left in her blood. He had proven that you can't always tell the difference. He had been right about her, and that was the hardest thing to swallow. He had banked on her desperation. He knew she would ignore the gaps in his story because she needed the rent check to clear. He knew she would see what she wanted to see. But he had gotten one thing wrong. If the police had arrived 2 minutes later, if the call had dropped, if she had hesitated on the stairs. But she hadn't hesitated, and that was the revelation that finally cut through the fog. For years, her ex-husband Richard had made a career out of calling her crazy. He had dismissed her gut feelings as hysteria, gaslighting her until she barely trusted her own senses. But when the chips were down, when the air turned wrong and the house held its breath, she hadn't listened to Richard's voice in her head. She had listened to the primal alarm bell ringing in her gut. She had grabbed the bat. She had thrown the hammer. She had screamed. That was the lesson. It wasn't about learning to trust strangers again. That would take time. It was about learning to trust herself. It was about accepting that the voice whispering something is wrong wasn't paranoia. It was survival. She finished the tea and went to bed, but she didn't touch the light switch. The hallway bulb stayed burning, casting a warm, defiant yellow glow into the bedrooms. Hazel didn't mind. She said the light kept the bad dreams away. Laura pulled the duvet up, eyes open, listening to the hum of the secure building. They would heal. It wouldn't happen tonight and maybe not tomorrow, but eventually they would find the middle ground between living in fear and living in denial. They would learn to walk through the world again. But for tonight, the deadbolt was thrown, the lights were blazing, and they were alive. And that was enough. But tonight, sleep wasn't on the agenda. She lay there staring at the ceiling, auditing the sounds of the building. She was building a new library of normal. The hum of the elevator, safe. The heavy footsteps in the hall, just the neighbor coming off the night shift. She was constructing a new architecture of safety built on the brutal truth Frank Sutherland had taught her. Monsters are real. They don't have claws or fangs. They have polite smiles and clean shirts. They rent your basement and plan your execution while making small talk about the weather. That knowledge was etched into her DNA now. It would color every handshake, every introduction, every moment she felt herself relaxing. It wasn't comforting, but it was a form of armor. It was the heavy, cold realization that survival isn't a guarantee. It's a job that requires eternal vigilance. Trust was no longer a basic human right. It was a luxury item she couldn't afford to buy. Outside, the sky began to bruise with the gray light of dawn. It was just another morning, but to Laura, it was a scoreboard. It was proof that she had navigated the minefield for one more night. She had kept Hazel safe. She had made it through. 40 miles away, the water in the quarry was black and still. The dive teams were just getting back to work, sliding into the murk to recover what was left of the lost. 8 bodies so far, but the water was deep and the bottom was full of shadows. How many more were down there in the silt? How many other lonely people had accepted a cup of coffee from a nice stranger and paid for it with their lives? How many families were staring at phones that would never ring again? There were no answers to those questions. Laura was done asking them. She was done trying to psychoanalyze the void, done trying to understand why Frank Sutherland chose her door, or why he felt entitled to consume human lives like fuel. Some questions don't have satisfying answers. Some darkness just exists without reason or logic, simply because human beings are capable of creating it. You can't rationalize a cancer. You can only survive it. And she had survived. Hazel had survived. In a world full of open graves and smiling predators, that wasn't just a victory. It was a miracle. And for now, it had to be enough.